Today I wrote down some notes to talk about, what I'm thinking when I'm thinking about what it means to be an intellectual, what it means to be a critical theorist in the 21st century. And recently I started to read quite a bit of Hannah Arendt in preparation for teaching a course on Hannah Arendt. And Hannah thought one of the biggest challenges, one of the most dangerous conditions that we have facing us is the condition of non-thought, the inability to think. So on the one hand, we have scholars, intellectuals, theorists and whatnot who are thinking and cultivating high idea and thinking about very abstract thoughts and somehow applying it to society and applying it to eternal concepts, things like this. And at the same time, in a parallel world, we've got millions upon millions of people who aren't engaged in thinking at all, like thought, really critical thinking, thinking in depth about anything serious really isn't in their purview. For some, it's because they can't, right? Just material wise, they don't have the capabilities or possibilities to do it because of their material conditions that they're living in. And on the other hand, you have those who can but won't, right? They just simply, it's not something that they find meaningful. It's something maybe they've never done. It's possibly because they're always sitting on their phone, looking at their phone, right? So for instance, it makes me think of when I was teaching a philosophy course, the introduction to philosophy course, just not so many years ago. And at some point in time, in the middle of a course, I just slammed my book on the desk and said, "Where are you guys? You're in college. We've given you, society has given you 4 to 5 years to basically delay your adulthood or your adult responsibilities so you can go and cultivate yourself and prepare yourself for this society, for being a citizen, right, in a globalized world." And I had one of the students in the front row, and she said, "Dr. Byrd, it's not that we can't do this or that we haven't read philosophy before," because clearly they haven't read philosophy before. She's like, "But these questions have never even been thought of by us ever." And so I asked them, I'm like, haven't you ever, gone out in the middle of the night and maybe in a field or something where there's no light pollution and just looked up at the sky and seen the stars, see the planets, see the Milky Way? And because just by doing that, that should at least conjure up some questions about what it means to be human, questions about time, questions about being relevant to history, questions about, is any of this permanent? All those questions that should come up just by looking at the stars at night. And most of them said they've never done that. They've never had the opportunity, or they just never thought of doing that, or just never in their purview. They spent most of their time looking down at a phone and not looking up at the sky. And so for me, looking at this condition, it reminds me of, like, we're beings towards non-thought. And that's part of the 20th first century condition. So, one of the things I think that philosophers, critical theorists, for instance, have to really do is think in three ways. And that is thinking about the past, thinking about the present, and thinking about the future. And in thinking about the past, we have to be against the non-thought of purposeful forgetting. And we see that happening right now, at least in America, if you guys have been keeping up with this, with the issue of critical race theory. Um, in that is, critical race theory is a legal theory that looks at how law has been constructed in the United States in such a way that it will benefit one group of people and harm another group of people, intentionally harm another group of people. That'll give all the perks and benefits to one group of people, and that the other group of people will be systematically disenfranchised in so many different ways, and doing it under the guise of, actually, we're all free, we're all equal, right? And so it looks at the fraud or the hypocrisy of democracy and exposes it. And so what you have on now conjuring up against the even looking at this, talking about this in schools, is an anti-critical race theory perspective. And so, what's behind that is the purposeful forgetting, the idea that we must forget the history of slavery. We have to forget the history of racism, of Jim Crow, voter suppression, lynching, redlining, because if we don't forget that, we have to confront it. And if we have to confront it, we have to see our own responsibility for getting rid of it. And if we get rid of it, some of us will be losing our privileges, right? So in that sense, we don't want it to come to the forefront. We certainly don't want our kids to know about it. We want basically the narrative that America is good, has always been good. The Constitution is the most wonderful document ever created. If you ask a Christian, it's second most to the Bible, right? And somehow, then when these bad things do happen within the context of the perfect society, they're just little mistakes, and we just fix them as we go along, as opposed to seeing them as a systematic problem. So that non-thought there is percolates up in this sense, and as an attempt to not discuss, not think about these problems in any way, shape, or form. We even had this came up in the discussion of this, where it was some kind of administrator was telling teachers that if you're going to have a course or a book about the Holocaust in your course, that you have to have something that has an alternative narrative to it. And the poor teachers almost fell out of their chair, and they're like, the alternative narrative is the fascist narrative. It's the Nazi narrative. I mean, do you really want us to start teaching the Nazi perspective to our little kids? I mean, you're worried about them learning about racism in America, but you want us to teach them the Nazi perspective on the Holocaust? It's just absolutely insane, but it reminds me of the essay by Adorno that he wrote, The Meaning of Working Through the Past, which is a very famous essay. It's a great essay. And he writes in that the murdered are to be cheated out of the single remaining thing that our powerlessness can offer them: remembrance. And that remembrance is so important, or the remembrance of the innocent victims, right? Even if it's, an innocent victim that would somehow implicate your group, because your group was the one that caused them to be a victim. But wiping that clean somehow is something that I see that is systematically happening for intellectuals. I think we have to somehow take upon ourselves or claim what Walter Benjamin called the weak messianic power. And that weak messianic power is that we're not the Messiah. We can't redeem the dead, but we can somehow create the conditions where the innocent victim is no longer created, right? Where we change the conditions, therefore we're no longer creating the innocent victim. Now that's a utopia in a certain sense, right? As an uk topos, that which has no place, but it's an ideal, right, that we can somehow use in that struggle as it relates to the past. Now, so that's thinking about the past. As intellectuals, we have to think about the present moment as well. And that's against the non-thought of busyness, of everyday busyness, right? That we are always in multiple places at multiple times, at every given moment, right? That somehow we never have the time or the opportunity to sit and think, right? Because as soon as we sit and think or start to read something, we think, oh, I got to do this, and oh, I've got to do that. And if I don't take care of that while I'm thinking about it right now, I'm going to totally forget it. And then people are going to think I'm incompetent or whatever, you know what I mean? I mean, I did that just in getting the Zoom link out. I was reading Adorno and I'm like, I didn't send out the Zoom link, you know what I mean? And so you're in multiple places. And this is what people are calling mental dispersion. And that's being indicative of the modern condition, that we're constantly dispersed. We're never in one place mentally, but always in multiple places. And this mental dispersion leads to, in many ways, what I call thought reception. And that's the mental orientation of allowing others to do thinking for us. Because we're constantly busy, we don't have time to cultivate our own thinking. So what we do is we become more and more receptive to other people's thoughts thinking for us. And what that leads to, especially in the modern condition, is group non-think, not group think, but group non-think, right? And that is the passive acceptance of pre-manufactured ideas, right? That are espoused by elite institutions, which are passed along like memes in popular thought. So, if you talk to someone about, let's say, the Kyle Rittenhouse case that was just famously tried here in the US, most of the time you don't talk to people who have original thoughts on it. They're simply repeating what they heard on their favorite media outlet, right? So you got a bunch of lawyers, or every now and then an intellectual, but not too often, a bunch of pundits. They give you their position, this is their ideas about the whole thing, and then it somehow filters down like a meme to everyone else, and people simply repeat them. And so we're creating these popular orthodoxies on these very complex situations, and these ideas are very simple, right? They're not the consequences of in-depth thought and critical thinking, but they're basically orthodoxies that are created by a certain interest that are passed along. And because people don't have time to read and to think and to ponder, this is a substitute. It's an ersatz thinking, if you will, a substitute form of thinking, but it's non-thought. Right. And that's something that we have to ask, qui bono, who benefits from that, from this popular, programming of the masses, of the people. And it's very interesting, in working with Syed Hussein Alatas's work right now on mental captivity. For me, it looks like a form of mental captivity, because those who surrender to group non-think, they don't have, they struggle with what he calls the captive mind, because their captivity itself banishes the mental apparatus needed to recognize its own captivity. Right? They don't have the capacity to realize that they're captive to the very programming that they're getting willingly, because they're the ones that turn it on and look at it, right? And it's a lot like the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you will. So thinking about the present is the third category that I think for intellectuals we have to integrate with thinking about the past into the present, but we also think about the future. And for me, thinking about the future in related to the present is to think against the retrotopians and the positive metaphysicians. Now, what I mean by that is that the philosopher, the critical thinker, has to become a futurologist, right? A nice word that came up by Osip Flechtheim so many decades ago, but they have become futurologists. So they have to read the trends of the past and the present to determine the likelihood of the future, right? Who can think, and ponder and question and read these trends greater than the intellectuals who have the time, the energy, the resources, the education, right, to sit, look at how history is moving and try to figure out where it's leading to. And it's not to that we can become prophets or soothsayers or anything like that, but rather we have to become warners, if you will. We have to become like the Cassandras. Now, of course, Cassandra, of course, is condemned to speak the truth so that no one ever believes them. But I think philosophers have been doing that for a long time, right? But we have to do it before it's too late, right? We have to be very vocal about these things. We have to somehow bring these things to the masses. This kind of discourse, these kind of questions, and sometimes we don't have all the answers, but people aren't even aware of the questions. So we have to at least bring the questions to the people about where we're heading in the future, right? And we have to do this, I think, in a very ecumenical way. And so that means we, say intellectuals, sociologists, philosophers, we have to go to school with each other. Right? We have to go to school with psychologists. Sociologists have to go to school with historians, and philosophers have to go to school with scientists. And we have to all go to school with the artists and the musicians, because they're the ones that express that horror and terror and suffering of everyday existence in such a way that we can all experience it. And so we have to be very ecumenical in that, because for me, what I see as one of the greatest threats, at least to Western civilization, and we all know when Western civilization goes through its fits, its collective outbreaks of Thanatos, it migrates to the rest of the world, right? We have to really look at the consequences of neoliberal capitalism in its, I mean, it's optimistic to say late stage, but right? That used to be a more of a buzzword, late stage capitalism. But you know, I think people are very optimistic, but it finds ways to perpetuating itself. But it creates a certain condition that is causing other people to become more and more retrotopian, right? That they're seeing the future of civilization in the past. It's not a future oriented remembrance of the past and with a practical intent to alleviate suffering, but it's a future orientation remembrance of the past to reproduce the past in the future, right? It's reversing the dialectic of history. That which has already been dialectically negated is that which has to be resurrected and brought into the future. And of course, we can see through history, every time there's an attempt to reconstruct the past in the future, it's led to catastrophe, just absolute catastrophe. And yet, because of modernity, is becoming, as as Marcuse once called it, just horrible. Right, that the modern world is becoming increasingly horrible. And Horkheimer, I think, called it the totally dark world. That it's causing more and more people to look not to the future optimistically, but look to the back, look to what's behind them, look to the past in a way that's very romantic, and hopefully they can bring those the assurity of the past, of the imagined past, if you will, right, back into the future. And we see this type of problem with the rise of nationalism and fascism in the Western world. 74 million of my compatriots thought it wise to vote for someone who would love to end democracy and install himself as a dictator. And, people will deny that that's not what they want. But if you actually get into the nitty gritty with them, with the dirt, where the rubber meets the road, you'll find out that they would much rather have the dictatorship of Donald Trump than to ever lived with, the chaos and uncertainty of democracy, right? And that's what we're facing. And really the only way that we can systematically address that is through education, right? But of course, educare, or that which leads out of ignorance, at least in America, is itself part of the process which reproduces the very conditions that cause the rise of nationalism and fascism, right? It's no longer leading people out of ignorance. I mean, we have a focus on STEM, right? The science, tech, and engineering and mathematics, which is good. Right, we need that stuff. I mean, it's tremendously interesting. There's a lot of places where I'll say, look, I don't need, as a philosopher, I don't need to be there. We need good scientists on there, right? You don't need a philosopher to muck it all up here. You need good science. But we also have to realize that, that to have nations of citizens, they also have to be people who are liberated from ignorance. And that's what education, even educare, back to the Latin, is meant to do. But we've focused on now training over education. We've elevated the arts mechanae, right? The servile arts above the liberal arts, right? The arts liberales. We put job training over literature, over arts, over philosophy, over sociology. So students will say, how the hell is reading Dostoevsky going to get me a job? Right? How is learning about Plato's Republic gonna get me the six figures that I want? right? And the idea that you get a liberal arts education as a way of becoming a citizen of your country, or a global citizen, that is just melting away, because it comes deeply, things become just pragmatic. I go to college to gain certain skills, so I can gain a certain job, so I can gain a certain lifestyle, so I can buy a house in a vanilla suburb and have, three, imported cars, right? And that's what I call success. And the fact that I don't know anything about Dostoevsky or Plato, or I don't listen to jazz, or none of that's my word, doesn't matter, right? As long as I have the right skills for the right kind of job, for the right kind of lifestyle. And unfortunately, that's the kind of education that produces people who don't know how to resist fascism, who don't know how to resist nationalism, that in some cases are easily recruited into fascism, into nationalism. Adorno levels a new, what he calls the new categorical imperative on us as educators in his essay, Education After Auschwitz. And that is that we should never allow Auschwitz to happen again. And Auschwitz for him, of course, isn't just simply, the extermination of the European Jewry. Auschwitz for him is the total crimes against humanity, right? So Srebrenica would be Auschwitz, right? Rwanda is Auschwitz, right? The mass killing of African Americans, which, let's be honest, it's a mass killing of African Americans, right? That's Auschwitz, this type of return of barbarity, that somehow barbarism survives within democracy. It survives, and fascism survives within democracy, right? And so we have positive duty to somehow combat that as much as we can. And as intellectuals, look, we're not the ones who are going to pick up the guns and go to the jungles and fight. That's not who we are. That's not our specialty, right? When Marcuse was one time called a revolutionary, he said, no, the revolutionaries are in the jungles, right? I'm an intellectual. I create ideas that somehow contributes to those revolutionary changes, but nevertheless, I'm not the revolutionary. And we have to be honest with ourselves and know our position. What can we do? And for me, the greatest thing we can do to resist this type of barbarism of the 21st century is to educate, and educate honestly, critically. And sometimes that means indicting ourselves, but nevertheless, that's what we have to do. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves in a really bad situation in the 21st century, just as bad as we found in the 20th century.